video, just a reminder to anybody who's watching any of our videos on Rumble that if you go to the top of the video and you will see a red maroon button, if you press it, that will take you directly to our locals homepage, where we have an active and vibrant membership which you can join, and where you can also join me for live streams every Wednesday. Now let's return to the crisis of the hour, which is of course the crisis in Ukraine. And here there's been important developments on the military side of things today. Firstly, early this morning, reports started to trickle through, subsequently confirmed by the Russian Defense Ministry and not contradicted by the Ukrainians, at least not so far as I'm aware, that the important strategic town of Volnovakha has now been captured by the militia of the two breakaway republics of the Donbass and by the Russian military. Now, I'm not, as I've said many times, an expert in military things, so I'm not perhaps the best person to explain the logic, the importance of this capture of this town. However, it's clear that both sides, both the Ukrainians and the Russians, attach great importance to it. It's a town, it's a settlement in eastern Ukraine. Apparently it was an important headquarters and logistic center for the Ukrainian forces that were based along the contact line with the two republics of the Donbass. And it was a town which the Russians and the militia needed to capture if they were to complete and tighten fully their encirclement of the Ukrainian army in eastern Ukraine, which, as I've discussed in many previous videos, is the primary Russian objective and is the focus of their military offensive. So the fall of Volnovakha can also be illustrated by another fact, which is that a couple of days ago, Zelensky declared it a hero city of Ukraine, something which suggests how important it was to the Ukrainians, and the fact that it has fallen, I suspect, is going to be a factor of some dismay to them. This comes alongside news that the other important stronghold of the Ukrainian military in eastern Ukraine, the town of Mariupol, is now coming under very heavy pressure. Apparently the militia of the two Donbass republics is in the center of the city. There's still street fighting going on, but the suggestions are that Mariupol may fall at some point over the next couple of days, perhaps this weekend. I will say that, as I had understood it, Volnovakha and Mariupol were where the best forces of the Ukrainian military were concentrated. I should say the best military in eastern Ukraine. And it does seem that their fall is happening faster than certainly I had anticipated. Again, I stress I'm not a military person, but I wonder whether the effective encirclement of these troops isn't beginning to take its toll, by which I mean whether they may be running out of logistics, ammunition, food, perhaps even water, and that they're finding it increasingly difficult, therefore, to continue fighting in the way that they previously did. Now, I've discussed many times on this channel the fact that the focus of the Russian effort is to encircle and destroy the Ukrainian army in eastern Ukraine by creating what the Russians like to call a cauldron, a trap in which it is essentially encircled and is forced either to lay down arms or disintegrate. And it's a striking fact, which I'm sure many of you have noticed, that the Western media, very focused on events in Kiev, where in fact there's been very little fighting indeed, have almost completely ignored the fighting in eastern Ukraine, or that the Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine are being encircled. Now, that changed yesterday with a report in the London Times. Now, the report was principally about the fighting in Mariupol, but it did contain this extremely important sentence, which section, which is the first admission in any legacy or mainstream Western media outlet that the Ukrainian army is facing encirclement and crisis in eastern Ukraine. Now, the entire article is behind a paywall, but I will read the relevant section. In the most likely scenario, Ukrainian forces located along the former line of contact, the front line between Ukrainian forces and separatists before the invasion, would face either logistic isolation and encirclement. Moscow would be able to unite the Russian-backed rebels in eastern Ukraine with its troops in Crimea, also a symbolically important feat that would highlight Russia's expansion. Western officials said that encircling the Ukrainian forces in the east was paramount. The word paramount is given in inverted commas. In other words, it's given. It looks like a quotation from some senior Western official. So Western officials said that encircling the Ukrainian forces in the east was paramount to the success of the operation, because that was where the most effective, capable and trained and equipped Ukrainian forces were in the country, and now there's a quotation, there will be a need to encircle those forces to prevent them from interfering with a military operation. So that is the first admission I have seen anywhere in the Western media, that the major focus, the center of gravity, if you like, of this war is not in and around Kiev, where all the journalists, the Western journalists, are gathered. It is in eastern Ukraine that the Ukrainian army in eastern Ukraine is in the process of being encircled. The Russians, of course, say that it has already been encircled, and that its encirclement and eventual collapse would create a crisis for Ukraine, a crisis which militarily it might not be able to survive. So that's the first admission of this, and it's from a Western official to the London Times. It shows to my mind that Western governments, despite all of the reporting that we've been hearing about heroic Ukrainian resistance in and around Kiev and all of that, are actually and in reality perfectly well aware of what is going on the ground, and are fully aware that events are turning out otherwise from what the Western media up to now has been reporting. Now, I'm going to just add a few further words. If Mariupol does indeed fall within a few days, some suggestions, which of course it's not again for me to discuss, but it might fall even as soon as some point over the course of this weekend. Perhaps next week is more plausible. That's my guess. But if Mariupol does fall, then the collapse of the Ukrainian army in the Donbass will follow very shortly after. That will, of course, release the bulk of the Russian army for further advances into central Ukraine. Now, whether they would want to do that is, of course, another matter. I'm not going to try and speculate or guess what the Russian plans are, certainly not their military plans. What we do know is that their diplomacy, that they're continuing their diplomacy, and that over the course of a conversation which Putin had over the course of today with the Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko, Putin seemed to be optimistic that the Ukrainians are slowly coming to a realization of the disaster that they're facing in the east, and that will finally force them to come to terms. Well, we shall see. I mean, at the moment, the Ukrainians are saying different things to different people. They seem to be indicating to the Russians that they're willing to negotiate about neutrality. To the Western powers, of course, they're talking about their willingness to fight to the death, something which I don't think anybody ought to urge them to do, given the disastrous effect on their country if they did that. I will finish on this summary of the military developments so far as I can understand them. And again, they always come with a caveat that, as I said, I'm not a military person or a military strategist or technician or any of these things. But I would finish also by saying that the mayor of Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko, has now said that around half the population of Kiev has left the city. And it does seem as if the Russian ring around Kiev is also slowly tightening. I suspect that at the moment there are still no Russian plans to storm Kiev, but of course if the situation in eastern Ukraine results, as it now seems certain to do, in a Ukrainian collapse, and assuming that the Russian army is then able to move into the center of Ukraine, at that point it looks to me as if Ukraine's capital, Kiev, it becomes undefendable, and a collapse at that point in Kiev may follow. What that would mean, I'm not absolutely sure. It may be, however, that rather than have that happen, the Ukrainians will finally do that which the Russians are asking them to do, which is to come to the negotiating table and effectively agree to the demands that the Russians are making of them. Anyway, that's my summary of the military developments. I would finish by mentioning, finish about the events on the ground in Ukraine by saying that it does seem that the humanitarian corridors that the Russians have been trying to negotiate with the Ukrainians for the last couple of days are now functioning after a fashion in some Ukrainian cities, not, it must be said, in Mariupol, but perhaps in places like Kharkiv and elsewhere, and civilians are being evacuated, and also foreign students, some of whose evacuations were prevented, each side, the Russians and the Ukrainians, accusing the other of being responsible for that. Anyway, so advances by the Russians in the east and center of Ukraine, their capture of an important point, city, Volnovakha, the imminent capture of Mariupol, indications that the Ukrainians might be starting to shift their negotiating position, and a tightening ring around Kiev as the humanitarian corridors start to enter fitfully into life. So that's where I think we are with the situation on the ground. Now, of course, all of this is happening against the backdrop of a titanic economic conflict. And here I would like to make a few general observations. Firstly, it's clear that the Europeans, having looked down the abyss of cutting themselves off from Russian oil and gas, have now drawn back and decided not to do it. There was a big summit in France, in Versailles, the Palace of Versailles. Actually, to say it properly, it's the Chateau of Versailles on Thursday. All sorts of people were there, all the European Union people were there. There was much discussion about what to do, but it's clear that that the European Union will not will continue to import oil and gas from Russia, and that there is no intention at the moment to extend any further financial sanctions against Russia. There's not going to be any move to disconnect any further Russian banks from the SWIFT interbank messaging system. So that means, by the way, that 70% of the Russian banking system is still connected to SWIFT, with the rest of the banking system, in some ways, by the way, the more resilient part of it, now rapidly moving across, unrolling its Mir and Union Pay cards, which take it completely out of the Western financial system. Now, this has happened alongside a very interesting report from the Russian news agency Interfax, which has reported that the Russian parliament is now railroading through at very great speed a law which allows Russian banks to sell gold, platinum, silver, palladium ingots to investors in return for foreign currency. Now, the relevance of this is a point made in the live stream that we did a few days ago on the DURAN, and where we were joined by the amazing and wonderful Tom Longo. And Tom Longo, in that live stream, mentioned that he thought it highly likely that, especially in terms of its internal operations of the ruble, the Russian government would, before very long, move towards a gold-backed ruble for Russia's internal trade, even as it seeks to drain foreign currency out of the Russian economy. In other words, concentrate all holdings of foreign currency in its own hands. And I've discussed this report, the report of this bill, with Tom Longo, and he made the point to me that this is exactly in line with his idea that we are indeed looking towards the Russians working steadily towards a gold-backed ruble in terms of their own internal arrangements. Now, that's probably going to have not going to be relevant to the external operations of the ruble, but it does seem as if the Russians are doing exactly what Tom Longo expected that they would do, as they seek to convert the entirety of their financial system from use of foreign currencies. And here, by the way, whilst we're talking about financial sanctions, another surprising thing happened today. Today was supposed to be the day when the Russians were going to start defaulting on their foreign debt obligations. But to most people's surprise, in fact, to practically everybody's surprise, Gazprom, the big Russian gas monopoly, export monopoly, I should say, paid $1.3 billion of its external debt to its creditors when it fell due. And it looks as if the big financial giants, the big industrial giants of the Russian economic system, are going, for the time being at least, to go on paying off their debts, at least for the moment, and to do so in foreign currency, avoiding the possibility of a default. I would say it would be a technical default. I would call it force majeure, were it ever to happen. And one should be always careful, I think, in saying that a default by a particular Russian company, even a state-owned company, is default by the Russian state. But never mind, that's what people would say. But anyway, a lot of people were caught by surprise by Gazprom's move. And as has been pointed out, Russian external debt, which is not very big relative to the size of the Russian economy, is anyway concentrated in a very small number of big companies, big corporates, most of whom have very extensive cash reserves. So it could be that they will be gradually unwinding this external debt to the extent that they need to by themselves, obviously with the agreement of the Russian authorities, the finance ministry and the central bank, and that this default that many people are expecting may be more delayed than some people anticipate, or perhaps, and I'm not an expert in these things either, perhaps it won't happen at all. And I say that because oil and gas, energy prices are continuing to rise. The Europeans are making it clear that they will continue to import Russian energy products. The result is that the flow of hard currency, of dollars and euros and yen and British pound sterling into Russia, continues at a substantial rate, especially if, as I think is very likely, we start to see oil traders start to deal in Russian oil again before very long, in which case Russia will have preserved its cash flow, even if it has lost half of, the central bank has lost half of its foreign currency reserves, in which case not only can it continue to service its debts, but of course that will presumably over time mean that it will be able to start rebuilding its cash reserves, even those which have been confiscated in the way that they have. Whilst I am on this topic, the central bank, the Russian central bank, has been taking soundings of various economic forecasters within Russia about the effects of what's happening on the Russian economy and of what's happened in terms of the sanctions, what effect they will have on the Russian economy. And this comes directly after a lengthy meeting which Putin had with his top economic advisors in Moscow, in which they talked about the progress, the future of the economy now that it's under sanctions. And it was very interesting because the officials, the Prime Minister Bichtchute, the Finance Minister Siluanov, the Mayor of Moscow Sobyanin, all told Putin that the financial system in Russia is stable, continues to operate smoothly. There's no panic withdrawal apparently from Russian banks. Everything seems to be, or at least this is what the government tells us, maybe not always true, but this is anyway what they're telling us, and it seems to be borne out by general events, that everything is functioning on a fairly smooth basis. There is the prospect of much higher inflation this year, and the economic forecasters thought it might go as high as 20%, which would be indeed very high, but not perhaps certainly not nowhere close to hyperinflation, and so nowhere close even to Turkish levels. Well, we'll see whether that's right. It seems those forecasters were not taking anyway into account the kind of things that the government itself might do. I would say that if we are looking at 20% inflation in Russia, and that seems to be the absolute upper range at which it could go, then we need to take that in context with the fact that we're almost certain now to see double-digit inflation in the West. Many people think, of course, that in the United States we have that already. So it may be that in practice and in fact the difference is not so great, and that this high inflation number in Russia is not perhaps quite as different from what we are going to get in the West as one might expect. But beyond that, the same forecasters, who, as I said, apparently lean on the pessimistic side, thought that inflation would fall rapidly in 2023 to around 8%, and then would fall back to around close to the Russian central bank's target of 4% in 2024. And they also predicted that after a severe recession this year, the Russian economy would return to growth in 2023 and would achieve faster growth in 2024. So there we are. High inflation and a severe recession in Russia this year. That's baked in the cake. I think it's unavoidable. But then we're going to get high inflation and an almost certain recession in the West too this year. But in Russia, at least, they're looking towards recovery in 2023 and 2024, with a return to fully stable economic conditions in 2024. I think from the Kremlin's perspective, if these forecasts turn out to be right, then this will all have been fully worth it. If they have solved the problem of Ukraine once and for all, as they're looking increasingly likely to do, then a difficult year economically will be a price worth paying. That's anyway my own assessment of the Kremlin's thinking. Well, we will see where we go from here. Last but not least, I'm going to mention a conversation which the French Foreign Minister Le Drian had with the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Some people are trying to find in the Chinese Foreign Minister's words some change from the Chinese position, some attempt by the Chinese to put distance between themselves and the Russians. I've read the readout, the Chinese readout, in great detail. I cannot see any difference at all. It seems to me to be no more than a repetition of what are now, and have been for some time, the standard Chinese talking points. So I don't get the impression of any shift in China's position. In fact, I'm something at a loss to see where people